Look what we have here, boys. Another diversity hire sent to lower the standards, the voice drenched in the kind of casual arrogance that only a big fish in a very small pond can muster, cut through the low hum of the training facility. The crowd of cadets, a sea of gray sweats and nervous energy, rippled with sycophantic laughter. They turned to see Cadet Sergeant Marcus Thorne, his chest puffed out like a pouter pigeon, standing with his two shadows, Jenkins and O'Malley. His target was the new arrival, a woman standing by the edge of the sparring mats, methodically taping her hands. She was of average height, with a wiry frame that seemed almost lost in the standard issue fatigues. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face was a mask of placid neutrality. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She simply continued her task, pulling the white athletic tape taut with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency. From a shadowed observation deck overlooking the cavernous hall known as the Crucible, General Hayes watched, his eyes narrowed, not at Thorne's predictable peacocking, but at the woman's hands. He saw the faint, silvery tracery of old scars across her knuckles and the almost imperceptible way her stance distributed her weight, a perfect economy of balance that screamed of thousands of hours of instinctual practice. The general leaned forward slightly, a flicker of profound curiosity cutting through his customary weariness. Down on the floor, Thorne was just getting warmed up, his voice echoing with theatrical disdain. "Seriously, what's your name, sweetheart? Did you get lost on your way to the admin building? This is where the actual warriors train. We can't have you breaking a nail." More laughter, louder this time, emboldened by the target's utter lack of reaction. Her silence was a vacuum, and Thorne, like all insecure men, felt an overwhelming need to fill it with noise. He stepped closer, crowding her personal space, a classic intimidation tactic that had served him well in the rigidly hierarchical world of the academy. He was the top of his class, a physical specimen built by the book, and he saw in her everything he had been taught to despise, a perceived weakness, an exception to the rule, a threat to the purity of his meritocratic ideal. But when the general saw her stance, the subtle shift of her hips as Thorne approached, a motion not of retreat, but of preparation, he knew. He knew this wasn't an exception to the rule. This was a rule the cadets had never even learned existed. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the quietness of the hands, type competence below. The woman, officer candidate Alara Vance, finished wrapping her left hand. Each fold of tape was perfect, each press firm and deliberate. Her focus was absolute, a bubble of professional calm in a room crackling with juvenile hostility. She treated Thorne's monologue as ambient noise, no more significant than the distant clang of weights or the squeak of training shoes on the mats. This infuriating lack of engagement only fueled Thorne's fire. He saw it as disrespect, a silent challenge to his authority as the unofficial king of the Crucible. "Hello, Earth to Token Officer. I'm talking to you," he sneered, gesturing dramatically to his audience. "See, this is the problem. They send us people who can't even follow a simple conversation. How are you supposed to follow orders in the field?" Jenkins and O'Malley chuckled on cue, their expressions a perfect blend of admiration for their leader and contempt for his victim. The rest of the cadets watched, a captive audience to a public humiliation. Some shifted uncomfortably, their own insecurities preventing them from intervening. Others smirked, enjoying the spectacle, reinforcing the brutal social calculus of the academy. In this environment, strength was performative, and Thorne was the master thespian. Vance, in her profound stillness, was an anomaly they couldn't compute. She finally looked up, her eyes a calm and steady gray, meeting Thorne's for a brief, unreadable moment. They held no fear, no anger, no indignation. They held nothing but a quiet, unnerving assessment. It was like a geologist looking at a rock. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a minimalist acknowledgement that she had, in fact, heard him. Then her gaze dropped back to her hands as she started on the right one. That simple, dismissive gesture was more insulting to Thorne than any verbal retort could have been. It dismissed him. It rendered him, his status, and his entire performance utterly irrelevant. The blood rushed his face. He had intended to make an example of her, to solidify his dominance before the final evaluations. Now, he felt an urgent need to break her composure, to force a reaction, to prove that his power was real. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. The instructor, a grizzled master sergeant named Croft, watched from the side, his face impassive. His job was to forge warriors, and in his experience, the forge was often cruel. He would let this play out. It was a test for all of them. The formal challenge was announced by Master Sergeant Croft, his voice a gravelly bark that demanded immediate silence and attention. Listen up. Your final evaluation for the Special Warfare Candidacy Program is now. Simple rules. King of the Hill. Last 3 standing get my recommendation. The rest of you can look forward to a rewarding career in logistics. A tense murmur went through the crowd. This was it. Months of relentless training, all boiling down to this brutal, zero-sum competition. Before Croft could even ask for the first challenger, Thorne's hand shot up, his eyes locked on Vance. "I'll go first, Sergeant," he announced, his voice ringing with renewed confidence. This was his arena. He pointed a thumb at Vance. "And I'll take the new candidate. Let's get the easy one out of the way and show her what real standards look like." A few of his followers cheered. Croft's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like Thorne's arrogance, but the kid was a powerhouse, a technically proficient brawler who had dominated every sparring session. Allowing this public call-out was unorthodox, but the crucible was designed to strip away civility and reveal the raw competitor beneath. He gave a curt nod. "Vance, you're up." Vance finished the last rap on her right hand, pressing the edge down with a finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. She stood, and for the first time, the cadets saw her fully. She wasn't just small. She was compact, every line of her body suggesting a density and purpose that her loose fatigues had hidden. She moved toward the center of the main mat with a fluid, gliding walk, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground. There was no swagger, no posturing, just a silent, inexorable advance. As she stepped into the circle, the narrator could describe her perspective, the way the noise of the room seemed to fade into a dull roar, the way the faces of the onlookers blurred into a meaningless periphery. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the mat, to the geometry of the space between herself and the man opposite her. She saw not a cadet sergeant, but a collection of targets, angles, and levers. Her breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm, an internal metronome setting a tempo of profound calm against the frantic beat of the moment. Thorne, by contrast, was a spectacle of kinetic energy, bouncing on the balls of his feet, rolling his neck, cracking his knuckles. He was putting on a show, playing to the crowd, basking in the anticipated glory of his overwhelming victory. He saw a small woman, an easy target, a stepping stone. He failed to see the truth that General Hayes had glimpsed from above. He was a cadet preparing for a fight, while Alara Vance was a professional simply arriving at work. The fight began not with a bell, but with Thorne's explosive forward momentum. He charged across the mat, a bellow of raw aggression tearing from his throat, his right fist cocked for a haymaker designed to end the confrontation in a single, humiliating blow. To the untrained eyes of the cadets, it was an overwhelming display of power and speed. They braced for the impact, for the inevitable and brutal conclusion. But the impact never came. Just as Thorne's fist was about to connect, Vance moved. It wasn't a dodge or a block in the conventional sense. It was an evaporation. She shifted her weight to her back foot, pivoting her body a mere 15 degrees, and the punch that carried all of Thorne's momentum whistled through the empty space where her head had been a microsecond before. Her left hand came up, not to strike, but to gently cup his extended elbow, her fingers finding the nerve cluster with an anatomist's precision. Her right hand pressed lightly against his hip. It was a redirection, not a resistance. Thorne, propelled by his own unspent force and guided by her subtle influence, stumbled past her, his balance completely compromised. He staggered for a few steps before catching himself, whirling around with a look of pure confusion on his face. The crowd was silent, the expected outcome failing to materialize. Humiliation began to curdle Thorne's anger into pure rage. He had missed. He had looked clumsy. He roared and charged again, this time abandoning technique for a wild, flailing assault. This was what Vance was waiting for. She met his chaotic energy not with opposing force, but with a calm, surgical precision. As he lunged to grab her, she flowed under his arm, her body moving with a liquidity that seemed to defy physics. In a single, unbroken sequence of motion, she secured a grip on his wrist, stepped across his body, and dropped her center of gravity. It was a hip throw so perfectly executed, so utterly flawless, that Thorne was airborne before his brain could even process what was happening. For a brief, suspended moment, he was weightless, his entire body subject to the inexorable laws of leverage she had imposed upon him. He hit the mat with a deep, resonant thud that silenced the very air in the room. Before he could even gasp for breath, she was on him, her knee pinning his shoulder, her hands transitioning his arm into a lock that threatened to tear his elbow apart with the slightest application of pressure. It was over. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Alara Vance had not thrown a single punch. She had not uttered a single sound. She had simply disassembled him. The aftermath was a silence more profound and deafening than any explosion. The cadets stood frozen, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Thorne lay pinned, his face a mask of shattered arrogance and dawning horror, his chest heaving. He could only manage a choked, incredulous whisper that was audible to everyone in the tomb-like quiet. "That's not possible." The spell of shocked silence was broken by the sound of measured footsteps on the steel staircase descending from the observation deck. Every head turned. General Hayes moved with an unhurried authority that commanded the room more effectively than any shouted order. The cadets, jolted from their stupor, snapped to a rigid, if somewhat shaky, posture of attention. Master Sergeant Croft's face was a stony mask, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of deep surprise as the base commander strode onto the training floor. Hayes ignored the instructor. He ignored the rows of petrified cadets, and he walked past the prone and defeated form of Marcus Thorne as if he were a piece of discarded equipment. His focus was entirely on Vance, who had already released Thorne's arm and risen to her feet, stepping back into a posture of quiet neutrality, her work apparently concluded. The general stopped a few feet from her, his gaze intense and analytical. The entire population of the Crucible held its breath. Hayes didn't ask about the fight. He didn't comment on the result. He made a statement, his voice calm and resonant. The initial parry was textbook Krav Maga, a simple inside redirection. But the takedown, the fluid transition from the wrist lock to the hip throw, that was pure systema. You don't learn that combination in any American military doctrine. Who was your instructor? For the first time, Vance spoke in a full sentence, her voice clear and even devoid of any discernible emotion. Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne, sir. My father. A wave of confusion washed over the cadets. Thorne? Like Marcus Thorne? The general's expression didn't change, but a deep understanding dawned in his eyes. He knew of the legendary Master Chief Thorne, a ghost in the machine, one of the founding fathers of modern special warfare CQC techniques, retired now, but a living myth within the community. The general nodded slowly, a puzzle piece clicking into place. He turned to Master Sergeant Croft. "Sergeant, bring up the service record for Officer Candidate Vance, Alara M., and read it aloud." Authorization Hayes, Gamma 79er Croft, looking rattled for the first time in his career, fumbled with the ruggedized tablet he carried. He tapped the screen a few times, his eyes widening as the file loaded. He swallowed hard, his own assumptions crumbling into dust. Master Sergeant Croft cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the pressurized silence of the gymnasium. He began to read from the tablet, his voice strained, as if the words themselves were heavy. Name, Vance Alara M. Previous service branch, United States Navy. A low murmur rippled through the cadets. A prior service Navy candidate was unusual, but not unheard of. Croft continued, his voice dropping an octave. Highest enlisted rank achieved. Chief Petty Officer, the murmuring stopped. A chief. That was a senior non-commissioned officer, a leader, someone with years, often decades of experience. The idea of a chief petty officer attending a basic officer candidacy program was baffling. Thorne, who had pushed himself to his elbows, stared at her, his face ashen. The instructor's voice grew more deliberate, each word landing like a hammer blow. Unit of assignment. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. A collective, sharp intake of breath. It was a name spoken only in whispers, a designation that didn't officially exist. DevGru. The elite of the elite. Tier 1. The room seemed to grow colder. Jenkins and O'Malley exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The man they had mocked, the man they had helped corner this unassuming woman, was now looking at the floor as if hoping it would swallow him whole. Croft's voice was now barely a whisper, filled with a dawning reverence. Combat déploiement 6. Combat hours. Classified. Estimated in excess of 2,000, and she paused, taking a breath. Notable awards and commendations. Navy Cross. A gasp went through the room. The second highest award for valor in combat. Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, 3 awards for gallantry. Purple Heart. Wounded in action. The list went on. A litany of heroism that was simply incomprehensible to the cadets who had been laughing at her moments before. Special qualifications: lead combat medic, advanced breacher, military freefall jump master, master marksmanship instructor. Croft trailed off, looking up from the tablet, his eyes wide with awe. Classification: Tier 1 operator. The final words hung in the air, an irrefutable testament to the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. General Hayes let the weight of the revelation settle. He then turned to face Vance fully. In his eyes, there was no longer a cadet. He saw a fellow professional, a warrior of the highest possible caliber. Slowly, with a precision that bespoke decades of military discipline, he brought his hand up in a formal, perfect salute. It wasn't the casual salute one gives a junior officer. It was the salute of profound respect. A gesture reserved for Medal of Honor recipients and fallen heroes. Chief Vance, he said, his voice ringing with authority and sincerity. It is an honor to have you at this academy. My apologies for the profound ignorance of my cadets. He held the salute, a silent, powerful rebuke to every single person who had judged her, until she, with a crispness that was second nature, returned it. The story of what happened in the Crucible that afternoon did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the Academy's barracks, mess halls, and classrooms with the speed of a digital wildfire. At first, it was a garbled rumor. Thorne got taken down by the new girl. Then the details began to emerge, each one more unbelievable than the last. She didn't just beat him, she dismantled him. She never threw a punch. The general was there. He saluted her. By evening chow, the full story, complete with the staggering details from her service record, was the only topic of conversation. Cadets who had laughed at Thorne's jokes now spoke in hushed, reverent tones. They called her the Ghost, or the Chief, a living legend who had walked among them unnoticed. The security footage of the 3-second takedown was leaked from the instructor's office and became the Academy's equivalent of a viral video, watched and rewatched on countless tablets and phones. Cadets analyzed it frame by frame, marveling at the impossible economy of her motion, the sublime and terrifying competence. The incident became a base-wide parable overnight. Thorne's arrogant words, another diversity hire sent to lower the standards, were now repeated not as a joke, but as a solemn, cautionary punchline, a reminder of the fatal danger of making assumptions. The institutional culture, built on a foundation of visible strength and audible confidence, had been shaken to its core. The quietest person in the room had proven to be the most dangerous, and that fact recalibrated everyone's understanding of what a warrior looked like. Marcus Thorne was summoned to General Hayes's office that evening. He stood at attention before the general's large oak desk, his own reflection staring back at him from the polished surface, a pale and shrunken version of the Titan he had imagined himself to be. Hayes didn't raise his voice. He spoke in a low, disappointed tone that was infinitely more devastating. "You have talent, Thorne," the general began, "but your ego writes checks your experience can't cash. You stood in the presence of greatness today, and all you saw was a target for your own insecurity. Chief Vance has survived situations you cannot even imagine. She has held the lives of her brothers in her hands. She has bled for the flag you salute. And you treated her like an inconvenience. Thorne's carefully constructed world had been demolished, and in its place was a vast, echoing chasm of shame. He was formally stripped of his cadet command and placed on academic probation. The official punishment, however, was nothing compared to the internal reckoning. Thorne had built his entire identity on being the best, the strongest, the alpha. That identity had been publicly and effortlessly erased. For days, he was a ghost himself, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when required. The swagger was gone, replaced by a heavy, thoughtful silence. A week after the incident, he found Vance on the firing range, where she was coaching a group of struggling first-year cadets on breathing techniques. He waited until she was done, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He approached her hesitantly, a stark contrast to his previous invasion of her space. She saw him coming and simply waited, her expression as neutral as ever. "Chief," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. "Mom, what I did, what I said, there's no excuse. It was arrogant and ignorant. I was wrong. I'm sorry." He finally looked up, and for the first time, she saw not a bully, but a humbled young man confronting the wreckage of his own character. Vance looked at him for a long moment, her gaze analytical, as always. Then she gave a single, curt nod. "We all have blind spots, cadet," she said, her voice even. "The important thing is to learn from them. Focus on the training." And with that, she turned back to the nervous cadet who was still struggling with his sight picture, leaving Thorne standing there, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. Her lack of vindictiveness was, in its own way, the final and most profound lesson. She didn't need his apology, but she accepted it because a good leader knows how to salvage a teachable moment from a disaster. In the following weeks, the legend of Alara Vance grew, nurtured by her continued example. She never spoke of her past. She never lorded her skills over anyone. Instead, she was often found helping others, offering quiet words of technical advice, her instruction always precise, patient, and brutally effective. She taught not with stories of war, but with the philosophy of quiet competence. The spot on the mat where she had taken Thorne down was now unofficially known as Vance's Corner, a piece of sacred ground where cadets would pause for a moment before sparring, a silent tribute to the lesson learned there. A grainy still from the security footage, a close-up of her calm, focused face as she executed the throw, was printed out and pinned to the main bulletin board in the Crucible, right next to the official training schedules. There was no caption. None was needed. It was a permanent and silent reminder. Assumptions are a liability, and respect is earned in silence. A year passed. The Academy's graduation ceremony was held on a crisp, sun-drenched morning. The manicured lawns were filled with proud families and stern-faced faculty. Alara Vance stood among the graduating class, her new second lieutenant's bar gleaming on her shoulder. She had not graduated as the valedictorian or with any special distinction. She had deliberately kept a low academic profile, doing just enough to pass with ease while focusing her true efforts on mentoring the cadets who sought her help. Her mission at the Academy, a special assignment to observe and refine officer training doctrine from the inside, was complete. The true measure of her impact was not in the accolades she had avoided, but in the subtle, yet profound, shift in the Academy's culture. The new class of cadets, who had been first years when she arrived, were different. There was less of the loud, chest-thumping bravado of Thorne's era. They were quieter, more observant. They watched each other's hands, their stances, their eyes. They had learned from the legend of the ghost of the Crucible that skill was something you demonstrated, not something you announced. Marcus Thorne was also in attendance, receiving his own commission. He was no longer the golden boy destined for the Special Forces. He was being assigned to a standard infantry unit, his career path irrevocably altered. But as he crossed the stage, he seemed not bitter, but centered. He caught Vance's eye in the crowd and gave a slow, respectful nod. He had lost his rank, his prestige, and his pride. But in doing so, he had found a humility that would make him a far better officer and a far better man than he would have otherwise become. The lesson of that day in the Crucible had been his true graduation. The story itself had become institutional folklore, a foundational myth for every new generation of cadets. Master Sergeant Croft now used the security footage as the capstone of his first lecture to every incoming class. He would play the clip of Thorne's arrogant speech, then the silent, 3-second takedown, and finally, the stunning reveal of Vance's service record. He would then turn to the wide-eyed recruits and say, "Your first lesson here is this. The most dangerous person in any room is the one you underestimate. The true warrior doesn't need to advertise. Their competence speaks for them. Your job is to become competent enough that you no longer feel the need to speak at all." The legacy Alara Vance left behind was not a plaque on a wall or a trophy in a case. It was a silence. It was the thoughtful pause a cadet now took before judging a peer. It was the newfound respect for the quiet professional, for the unassuming expert who lets their actions speak louder than any boast. Her legacy was a standard of conduct, a behavioral blueprint for a new kind of leader, one who valued substance over style and precision over performance. The tale of the Ghost of the Crucible became more than just a story. It evolved into a teaching tool, a parable that illustrated the Academy's most vital, unwritten principle. True strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about mastering oneself. True authority wasn't granted by rank. It was earned through undeniable competence and unwavering character. The name Vance became synonymous with this ideal, a quiet mantra for cadets pushing themselves through the pain of training, reminding them that the goal was not to be the loudest in the room, but the most effective. Her legacy wasn't in the spectacular takedown itself, but in the deafening silence that followed it. A silence filled with the shattering of prejudice, the dawn of understanding, and the birth of a respect that echoed far longer and with far more impact than any shout ever could. For true power is not the ability to command attention, but the ability to command a situation with such quiet mastery that no one even realizes you are in command until the work is already done. It is the calm hand, the steady eye, the disciplined mind. It is the profound truth that the loudest voices often mask the deepest insecurities, while true competence finds its most powerful expression in stillness and in action. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.